Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With world food demand reducing amidst COVID-19, we are preparing for a lower milk price in 2020. And to discuss the factors at play and what is likely to happen in the coming weeks and months, I was joined by Head Economist at Teagasc, Kevin Hanrahan.
Well, the pandemic is having a number of effects. The principal thing is happening is that we've this health crisis, and governments all over the world have introduced very restrictive public health measures that have had the effect of halting lots of economic activity. But one of the things that hasn't really been halted on the supply side is that cows are lactating and they're being milked. But some of the halting of economic activities meant that demand has disappeared for that milk and the products we make out of the milk around the world. So particularly where lots of milk is consumed in liquid form, and that demand has dropped dramatically because canteens and school canteens have closed or restaurants have closed. We have seen in some places farmers and milk processors having to dump milk because they didn't have the capacity to process it into commodities that we can store, and the people who wanted to drink and eat those fresh dairy commodities weren't able or weren't allowed in some sense to eat and drink as normal. So that's happened in countries like Ireland, where the milk that farmers produce is most of it is used to make things like cheese or butter or skim milk powder or whole milk powder or fat filled powders. The processing industry, if the processing industry hasn't been affected by COVID-19, there has been no disruption to the milk being taken from farmers and processed as normal. Where the disruption is happening is that the demand for that butter and the cheese and skim milk powder and so on is now less than it would have been if COVID-19 hadn't happened, and is less than it was in advance of COVID happening. And what that means is that people aren't buying as much products. If they are buying, they still are buying food, of course, but they're tending to move down the price point, because they may have lost a job or they might be worried about losing their job. So the demand has contracted, and particularly in a country like Ireland, we haven't seen any disruption to the ability of the processors yet to process the milk that farmers are having taken away from their farms. But the demand for butter and cheese and skim milk powder, it has weakened. And it's weakened because the general world economy has gone into recession. And what's unusual about this year and this COVID-19 recession is that it's happening everywhere. I mean, everywhere around the world, and because governments around the world are doing things to protect the health of their citizens. And the key thing to do is to stop sort of interactions between people that lead the disease to spread, and that's required in some sense the closing down of lots of economic activity. So that hits people's pocketbooks, then they've less money to spend, and that's been reflected, unfortunately, from the perspective of farmers in a lower price for the product that they're producing.
And you mentioned in some countries, they've had this issue where they have to dispose of milk. And we've seen it on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, videos of farmers doing it. You mentioned, at the moment, our co-ops have the capacity to process the milk. Do you see, disposal of milk playing out on farms in Ireland, or, what's your take on that?
Everybody is doing their damnedest to make sure that doesn't happen. And what are they doing? They're introducing very, very strict social distancing and health protocols within milk processing facilities. Now they're doing as much as they possibly can, and they have agreed protocols in terms of what might happen if they break down. But so far, so good. There haven't been any plants in Ireland that have gone offline because of staff falling ill or staff having to self-isolate. But we know that because of the strong growth in the volume of milk produced by Irish dairy farmers, that the processing capacity has basically been running to stay a little bit ahead of the milk that comes at peak. And it wouldn't take very many milk plants or even maybe one of the big ones to go offline for there to be a problem. But the dairy industry, the cooperatives and the PLCs collectively have been very, very thorough. They're always very thorough in terms of the hygiene standards within the plants. So they started from a good place, but they've actually done extra work to try to ensure that they can still work to process the milk that's produced by the farmers, because it's in no one's interest in the short run or in the long run to have pictures associated with Irish dairy farming of milk being disposed of. Now, if it had to happen, which would be allowed, I think the dairy industry and the Environmental Protection Agency have agreed the kind of the standard operating procedure for it to be done if it was required. But hopefully everybody will continue to work to make sure that it doesn't happen.
And what are the implications for an individual farm, where they have to dispose of milk? What's the implications for the overall farm business?
If a farmer or a group of farmers, I don't think it would be the case that one farmer would have to do it. If a processor hadn't the capacity to process milk beyond a certain level, the pain, I'm sure, would be shared somehow amongst all of the suppliers into that co-op. But if you think about what would happen if if the electricity broke down and you didn't have a backup and your bulk tank all the milk went off before it was collected, you basically would have spent all the money producing that milk and you'd have nothing to show for it in terms of a milk check. So that probably wouldn't happen. But what might happen in the event that there was something like we're talking about of some sort of quantity of milk having to be disposed across a number of farms, all their milk checks would be reduced, not necessarily to zero, but would be reduced to reflect the fact that the milk that they all produced, some of it couldn't have been turned into something that people paid money for. So it would reduce the marketed output. You'd see a lower quantity effectively delivered to the processor, and that would be lost money. That would be like just throwing money just falling out of your pocket and gone. So it would be not a good outcome.
And turning our attention then to milk price, Kevin, you've mentioned that demand is down for dairy products, in terms of the overall context. But from an Irish perspective, we have seen milk price has dropped across the co-ops in the last month or so. Is this downward trend set to continue? And also, I guess, is this all a result of COVID-19? Or are there other factors at play with the reduced milk price?
I think at the moment, it's the very dramatic weakening in the commodity prices and the value of non-commodity dairy products like especially cheeses that is driving the global decline in milk prices. So it is really the demand shock that's coming from COVID. I mean, there was some optimism, I guess, cautious optimism coming into the year about where milk prices would settle this year. And that was on the back of some sort of better balance on the global market. But, when you have, all of the food service industry across the European Union basically shut down, you've got large reductions in activity in sectors like baking, for like croissants that are eaten in France, for example, and they're equivalent in other countries, which absorb a lot of butter. These levels of activity have just basically dramatically reduced or gone to zero. So the products, the dairy products, the butter, skim milk powder that would have been going into those just isn't happening. Now, people's consumption of dairy products and of products that incorporate dairy products, that in a parallel universe where COVID wasn't happening, would have been happening in their school canteens or in a bakery or in a restaurant. Some of that consumption is shifted to the retail channel. But the growth in retail, and it's the same across meat demand as well as demand for dairy commodities and products, the growth hasn't been sufficient to offset the loss coming out of the shutdown from the food service industry, and the weaker spending because of the fact that many people have either lost their job or are worried about losing their job. So they're less, when they go and get some cheese, they might go for the cheaper variety of a cheddar rather than the extra mature cheddar. And if that continues, and as that continues, and it's likely to continue for quite a while yet, that will be reflected in lower returns from the marketplace for milk processors, and some of that will be passed inevitably back in terms of a lower milk price to farmers in Ireland and farmers in other countries. I guess farmers in Ireland, because they are predominantly producing storable commodities, there sometimes is a bit of a lag between the transmission of this massive big demand shock into what they face in terms of their prices, as compared to dairy farmers in the UK, where the bulk of the milk that's produced is consumed in a liquid form, and where we have seen some instances of dumping of milk because demand just wasn't there. But the milk price that farmers get will inevitably reflect the lower returns from the marketplace, and that's what we're facing at the moment.
And looking back to 2019, and you and your team in Athenry would do some work in terms of forecasting and outlook for milk price. Prior to the challenge that we're facing at the moment, what did the milk price look like for the year of 2020?
The pre-COVID expectation was for a milk price of around 34 cents per litre at kind of a average fat and protein levels, fat of 4.17% and protein at 3.54%. So it wasn't a bonanza price, but it was a price where we were basically expecting incomes to be up at 4,000 or 5,000 euros on the average level of 2019. So we were expecting some moderation on the direct cost of production coming from lower feed and fertilizer prices, and a pretty okay milk price at 34 cents per litre. But what we're looking at now, as we go into the COVID world, farmers are already seeing prices they get for the milk falling, and unfortunately we don't yet know whether we've gotten as far down that price path as we're going to get to. But we know that we're now in the peak delivery months, and if the milk checks that farmers get this month and next month are down on that 34 cent a litre territory, well then the price average over the year is going to be close to what they get over in this month and the next month. So because these are the peak of the delivery, so that's when you weight up the average, the prices per month, this is where you're going to get most of your bang. So the price is lower, much lower than what we were forecasting. Now, we don't know with certainty what's going to happen on those international markets where most of our milk is consumed in terms of cheese and so on, butter and powders. So what we've done for government is we've done a number of scenarios at progressively more pessimistic average price outcomes for the year, in order to get to build up an assessment of what it probably is going to look like in terms of a family farm income outcome, and what's the worst that could possibly happen if things get really bad in terms of the price that farmers get for their milk. Now, if we start to go back to very, very dramatic declines in the prices that farmers get, some farmers will start to try to reduce their production because they may not be profitable on the last litre they produce. But we're not quite in that territory yet. I can't talk about the details of the analysis because they're being used by the government in terms of their negotiations with Brussels in terms of getting some aid measures for Irish farming in general, but they will come out in due course. But the lower the price goes down off of that sort of forecast that we had for this year back in November of last year, of in the low 30 cents per litre, 34 cents or so per litre, where every time the prices push further away from that down in a downward direction, we're losing money as compared to where we hoped to be this year.
And I guess, while it is lower than expected, Kevin, at a base price of 29 cents a litre, you know, a lot of farmers are still doing a really good job and getting a reasonable milk price. You know, fat and protein percentages are growing and getting better every year in terms of genetics, and we're also seeing that milk quality is improving. So, you know, the quality of the milk, and maybe in terms of TBC or somatic cell count, you know, it's lower and it's reducing all the time. So that's leading to, I suppose, a top up on the base payment. You know, you also mentioned, Kevin, about negotiations that are happening between the government and the EU. And I guess for a little bit of perspective, you know, you would have said it in the past, but also we would have spoken to a farmer at the very onset of COVID-19. So Kevin Toomey would have said, you know, comparing ourselves with other industries, we're not doing so bad. You know, the milk is still being produced, and the milk truck is still coming, you know, every 2 or 3 days to pick up the milk, and the check is coming in the post. But, you know, notwithstanding all of that, you know, I suppose, what way are the government, and maybe specifically the Department of Ag, in conjunction with the EU, you know, how are they supporting farmers through this challenging time?
So, I mean, Kevin was completely right, Kevin Toomey. I mean, you know, farmers they live in the countryside, they're out in the fresh air, their businesses haven't been shut down, but they are seeing lower prices. So they, you know, they're in relatively speaking, they're in not such a bad place, but they're not where they want to be. Prices are down, and that will mean incomes will fall. What are the government and the European Union doing? Arguably not enough, in the sense that what they've done to date is that they've announced a private storage aid for a limited set of agricultural commodities, and dairy commodities are in there. And I think the dairy processing industry have welcomed this private storage aid. We're awaiting the detail of how it will actually work. But we know that the money available is relatively small when you set it against the size of the dairy industry in the European Union 27. And believe it or not, the UK is still eligible for private storage aid during the transition period. So it's effectively the EU 28 of old that can get some of this aid, but it's very small, relatively small beer. But sometimes it takes only a little intervention to take product into storage to sort of to affect an impact on a commodity market. So maybe it will have a positive impact. But when you take product into storage, when inventories of dairy commodities build up, they do overhang the market. It's not like they disappear. They're there, and at some point they will have to be released back onto the market. This is private storage aid to the dairy processing companies and others to hold on to product, and that costs money. And we know that product will eventually come onto the market and will have a negative impact on the market as compared to a world where those inventories weren't overhanging the market. So, but as a short-term measure, it's welcome, but it probably isn't. It won't be enough to completely or very significantly mitigate the negative impact of COVID on the prices that farmers get for the milk that they deliver. But it certainly is welcome, and it signals, I guess, recognizes that this is a problem, particularly for farmers that are producing commodities that are not completely storable. Now, Irish dairy farmers are producing storable commodities, so and are some of the lowest cost and are the best producers of milk in the European Union. So they won't be the first that will be hit in terms of business sustainability by the price shock that we're facing into. The difficulty, I guess, for the agriculture industry in general, and maybe even more so for the dairy industry in Ireland and in Europe, is the dairy industry in Ireland and in Europe is probably one of the more profitable components of the ag sector. So as the agriculture sector in general goes looking for assistance, if there's a limited pool of money, that assistance will probably be directed towards those who are experiencing income shocks that may actually fundamentally undermine their ability to survive as farms.
And go a little bit further into detail there, Kevin. You know, you mentioned, meat consumption, as comparable with dairy, while, there is an increase in the retail market, it's not sufficient, in terms of replacing, say, the other areas that there would be consumption. Looking to the wider ag industry, what way is it affecting the other sectors?
It really is that right now it's that food service, so restaurants, canteens, factory canteens, school canteens, college kind of coffee bars that all sell food produced by farmers in Ireland or elsewhere. And that they've all been shut down. So particularly if what you produce on your farm is the type of stuff that where a lot of it ends up getting to consumers through restaurants or canteens or fast food outlets, then you're going to be hit more than if you're producing a product that, generally speaking, tends to get consumed through the retail channel. Everybody's still going to the supermarket to get their food. What people aren't doing is going to restaurants or grabbing a burger on their way home from work or from a meeting. So in that context, the Irish beef industry is being hit more negatively than the Irish dairy industry, because a bigger proportion of beef output from this country is consumed through the food service channel as compared to our butter output, our cheese output, or our output of powders. So, relatively speaking, the pain that is being felt and is going to be felt over the remainder of this year by beef farmers in percentage terms is going to be significantly larger than the hit that dairy farmers will take. But we know that dairy farm incomes are many multiples on average of beef farm incomes. So the absolute loss in euro terms will probably be larger on dairy farms, but as a share of their income, it'll probably be smaller. And that goes, the willingness of the government or the European Union to basically shovel money in to keep people going. They may concentrate on giving aid to those sectors which are hit the most, and where the hit is where the farmers are the least able to shift that pain. And unfortunately, where you start from is an important determiner of how well you'll come through this shock or any other shock. And for dairy farmers, their incomes are relatively high, and most dairy farmers are making a positive net margin on the milk they produced. This contrasts with beef farmers, many of whom are not making a net margin on what they're doing on the beef enterprise. If they are, it's relatively small. And what that means is that when a bump on the road comes, and COVID is a big bump, and many of those farmers would be to the pin of their collar and in a worse place than that to basically survive it. And that's why there's probably going to, if there is any intervention or direct income supports specifically for farmers, it'll probably be targeted at beef farmers. And farmers such as beef farmers who have not been able to market cattle are being treated, or should be treated, are being treated in the same way as other people who have lost their jobs in terms of eligibility for COVID payments. And dairy farmers, because they have regular milk checks and their milk is being collected and processed, as I understand it at least, are not eligible for those COVID-19 general income support payments. And that's a good thing in some sense, that they're still making money, maybe not as much as they would have liked to be making, but are still in a relatively good place as compared to other farmers.
I think we'll finish up there, Kevin, and it was really, really good to talk to you today to get some context on what's happening in the wider industry. And also it's really reassuring to hear that I suppose in terms of the industry and the co-ops, that there's such good work going on to ensure that we can continue to process product. And I guess from a support perspective, to see what interventions are happening and what kind of supports the government and the EU are offering us. Thank you, Kevin.
You're welcome, Emma-Louise, anytime.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Kevin Hanrahan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.